Senior Airman Rebecca "Becca" Martinez had always been the type to keep her head down and do her job. At 24, she was unremarkable in every way that mattered to most people. Average height, soft-spoken, with thick-rimmed glasses that she constantly pushed up her nose. When she arrived at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada for her assignment to the 482nd Wing's Maintenance Squadron, she looked more like a librarian than someone who worked on F-16 Fighting Falcons. Her new supervisor, Technical Sergeant Jake Morrison, made his opinion clear from day one. "Great, another desk jockey there trying to pass off as a real maintainer," he muttered loud enough for the whole shop to hear when Becca introduced herself. The other airmen snickered, and Becca felt her cheeks burn, but she just nodded politely and asked where she could start. Morrison was the kind of NCO who ruled through intimidation. 6'2" with arms like tree trunks, he'd been working on jets for 15 years and never let anyone forget it. He had a particular disdain for what he called college girls like Becca, who had her community college of the Air Force degree in aircraft maintenance technology. "Martinez!" Morrison barked on her third day. "You're on tool inventory duty." Again? This was the most tedious job in the shop, counting and organizing thousands of specialized tools used for aircraft maintenance. It was typically rotated among junior airmen, but Becca had been assigned to it every single day since arriving. While her peers worked on actual aircraft learning hands-on maintenance, Becca spent hours in the tool room with a clipboard, meticulously checking serial numbers against computer records. She didn't complain, though Morrison clearly expected her to. Instead, she worked quietly, methodically, and began to notice things. The tool inventory system was a mess. Serial numbers didn't match records. High-value items were logged as present when they were actually signed out. Some tools hadn't been accounted for in months. In the Air Force, missing tools on a flight line meant potential FOD, foreign object damage, that could destroy a multi-million-dollar engine or kill a pilot. "Sergeant Morrison," Becca approached him one afternoon, clipboard in hand, "I found some discrepancies in the tool accountability that we should probably—" "Martinez, the only thing you need to find is a way to do your job without bothering me every 5 minutes. Morrison cut her off. "The tool system worked fine before you got here, and it'll work fine after you leave." The other airman laughed. Airman First Class Danny Torres, Morrison's favorite, made a show of rolling his eyes. "Some people just need to feel important. You know?" Becca's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just concerned about accountability procedures. According to AFI 21101, according to me, you need to worry less about regulations and more about not screwing up the simple job you've been given," Morrison snapped. "Now get back in that tool room and let the real maintainers do the real work." That night in her dorm room, Becca sat on her narrow bed and stared at her notes. She'd documented 17 missing tools worth over $8,000, including a torque wrench calibrated for engine work. In civilian terms, it was like having a surgeon's scalpel go missing, dangerous and expensive. She thought about calling her mom back in San Antonio, but what would she say? That she was being treated like an outsider? That her supervisor was a bully? Her mother had worked 2 jobs to help pay for Becca's college, always telling her to work twice as hard to get half the respect. But Becca was already working twice as hard, and it wasn't getting her anywhere. The next morning, Morrison gathered the shop for the daily brief. "Listen up, people. We've got a readiness inspection coming up in 2 weeks. I need everyone focused on their aircraft, not chasing paperwork ghosts." His eyes found Becca. "That means everyone sticks to their lane and does what they're told." The message was clear. But as Becca walked back to the tool room, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Morrison was signing out the very torque wrench she'd marked as missing, using a serial number that didn't exist in the system. She was starting to understand that this wasn't just about her being the outsider. Something was very wrong here, and she was the only one who seemed to see it. The next week brought a new level of humiliation for Becca. Morrison had apparently decided that isolating her wasn't enough. He wanted to actively undermine her. During the morning briefing, he announced that Martinez would be transitioning to more administrative duties to better suit her skill set. In Air Force maintenance, being pulled from hands-on work was career suicide. Becca watched her peers head out to the flight line while she was assigned to update filing systems and input data. When she tried to explain that her AFSC, Air Force Specialty Code, required her to maintain proficiency on actual aircraft, Morrison just shrugged. "Take it up with the first sergeant if you have a problem," he said, knowing full well that challenging your supervisor was a good way to get a reputation as a troublemaker. But Morrison's biggest mistake was underestimating how much Becca noticed. Stuck in the administrative side, she had access to maintenance records, work orders, and parts requisitions that she'd never seen before. And the more she looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. Tools weren't just missing. They were being signed out using false serial numbers, then never returned. Parts were being ordered for aircraft that were deployed overseas. Work orders were being closed without the required inspections. It was a systematic breakdown of the accountability that kept million-dollar jets flying safely. "You're making yourself paranoid," she whispered to herself one evening, but the numbers didn't lie. The only person who seemed to notice her growing. Distress was Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a 7-year veteran who worked in the Quality Assurance Office. Maria had watched Becca work from a distance and been impressed by her attention to detail. "You look like someone who found a snake in their toolbox," Maria said one day, sitting down across from Becca in the chow hall. Becca looked up from her barely touched lunch. "Just trying to figure out some discrepancies in the records." Maria lowered her voice. "What kind of discrepancies?" For a moment, Becca considered brushing it off, but something in Maria's tone, concerned but not dismissive, made her open up. She explained about the missing tools, the false serial numbers, the parts orders that didn't make sense. Maria listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious. When Becca finished, Maria was quiet for a long moment. "Becca, you need to be very careful about this," she finally said. "Morrison's got friends in leadership. He's been here a long time." "So I should just ignore it?" Becca felt her voice rising slightly. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to be smart about it. Document everything, but don't go making accusations you can't prove." That night, Becca lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She thought about her father, who'd served in the Army during Desert Storm. He'd always talked about integrity being the foundation of military service. "You don't serve yourself," he used to say. "You serve something bigger." But serving something bigger was getting harder when that something seemed designed to crush her. The next morning brought a new humiliation. Morrison announced that Martinez had volunteered to work weekend duty for the next month, covering the tool room while others got time off. Becca started to protest, but Morrison's expression warned her to stay quiet. "Problem, Martinez?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No, Sergeant," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good. I knew we could count on your team spirit." As the shop dispersed, Danny Torres bumped into her, accidentally, sending her notebook flying. Papers scattered across the floor. Pages of her meticulous documentation. "Oops," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Maybe you should pay attention to where you're going instead of always having your nose in those books." Becca knelt to gather the papers, her hands shaking slightly, but as she picked up each page, she felt something shift inside her. These weren't just numbers and serial numbers anymore. They were evidence of something that could get people killed. She looked up to see Maria watching from across the hangar, concern written on her face. Maria gave her a subtle nod, a reminder to be smart, to be careful, but not to give up. That weekend, alone in the tool room, Becca began to organize her findings more systematically. She was starting to understand that this wasn't about her being weak or different. This was about her being observant, and sometimes being observant was the most dangerous thing you could be. 3 weeks into her documentation project, Becca witnessed something that made her blood run cold. She was working late in the tool room, again, when she heard voices from the main hangar. Normally, the shop was empty after 1800 hours, but maintenance schedules could be unpredictable. Peering through the small window in the tool room door, she saw Morrison and Danny Torres loading something into Morrison's pickup truck. Even from a distance, she could see the distinctive red tags that marked tools as calibrated precision instruments. They were stealing. Her heart pounded as she watched them work. This wasn't about missing paperwork or administrative mistakes. Morrison was running a theft ring, selling Air Force tools and equipment, and using his position to cover it up. Danny was his accomplice, which explained why he was Morrison's favorite, despite being barely competent at his actual job. Becca crept closer to the window, trying to get a better view, when her elbow knocked over a metal parts bin. The crash echoed through the hangar like a gunshot. Morrison's head snapped up, and his eyes met hers through the window. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Morrison said something to Danny, and they quickly finished loading the truck. Becca's hands shook as she pretended to clean up the spilled parts. When Morrison entered the tool room 5 minutes later, she was bent over, picking up screws and washers. "Working late again, Martinez?" His voice was casual, but there was something underneath it that made her skin crawl. "Yes, Sergeant, just finishing up the inventory reconciliation." "Find anything interesting?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Becca straightened up, pushing her glasses up her nose, a nervous habit she'd never been able to break. "Just the usual discrepancies. Nothing major." Morrison stepped closer, and Becca had to fight the urge to back away. "You know, Martinez, some people think you've been asking too many questions lately, poking around in things that aren't really your business. I'm just doing the job you assigned me, Sergeant." "That's good. Real good." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because I'd hate for someone to get the wrong idea about your dedication to the mission. New airmen sometimes get confused about where their loyalties should lie." After he left, Becca sat in the tool room for another hour, trying to stop her hands from shaking. She understood now that she wasn't just dealing with a bully. She was dealing with a criminal who had the power to destroy her career with a single bad evaluation. That night she called her father from her dorm room. "Mija, you sound upset," he said after hearing her voice. "Dad, what do you do when the right thing is also the dangerous thing?" Her father was quiet for a moment. During his army service, he'd seen enough corruption to understand what she might be facing. "Rebecca, you remember what I always told you about integrity. That it's what you do when no one's watching?" "That's right. But sometimes, Mija, integrity is what you do when everyone is watching, and they're all hoping you'll look the other way." The next morning brought the news that changed everything. An F-16 had experienced an engine failure during a training flight at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. The pilot ejected safely, but the investigation revealed that a critical torque wrench used in the engine maintenance had been calibrated incorrectly, the same type of torque wrench that Becca knew was missing from their inventory. As Becca read the safety report, her stomach dropped. She thought about all the times she'd tried to bring the missing tools to Morrison's attention. All the times he'd dismissed her concerns or told her to stop bothering him with paperwork. She thought about the pilot who'd had to eject from a failing aircraft, about the millions of dollars in taxpayer money that had just been destroyed, about how easily the pilot could have been killed. During the morning briefing, Morrison made a show of concern about the incident. "This is exactly why we take tool accountability so seriously," he told the assembled airmen. "One missing tool, one missed inspection, and people die." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Becca watched Morrison speak about the importance of integrity and accountability, while knowing he was stealing the very tools that kept aircraft safe. She watched her fellow airmen nod seriously, having no idea that their supervisor was putting their lives at risk for profit. That afternoon, Maria found Becca sitting alone in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "You heard about Luke?" Maria asked. Becca just nodded. "Becca, you look like someone who's carrying the weight of the world. What's going on?" For a moment, Becca considered staying quiet, keeping her head down, following the path of least resistance that had gotten her this far. Instead, she looked up at Maria with eyes that were no longer uncertain. "I think I know why that plane went down," she said quietly, "and I think I know how to prove it." That evening, Becca sat in her dorm room with a legal pad finally connecting. All the dots she'd been tracking for weeks. She wasn't just documenting missing tools anymore. She was building a case. Every false serial number, every missing item, every forged signature was part of a pattern that led straight back to Morrison. But she needed more than suspicions. She needed evidence that would hold up under scrutiny. The next morning, Becca did something she'd never done before. She volunteered for extra duty. Specifically, she asked to help with the upcoming inspection preparation, knowing it would give her access to records she'd never seen before. "Look who's finally showing some initiative," Morrison said when she made the request. But there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite approval. It was wariness. The inspection preparation gave Becca legitimate access to maintenance records going back months. Working late into the evening, she cross-referenced tool sign-out sheets with maintenance schedules, parts orders with aircraft assignments, and serial numbers with calibration records. The picture that emerged was even worse than she'd imagined. Morrison hadn't just been stealing tools, he'd been falsifying safety inspections, signing off on maintenance that was never performed, and creating phantom work orders to cover up missing equipment. The Luke Air Force Base incident wasn't an accident waiting to happen. It was an accident that had already happened and would happen again. But Becca also discovered something that gave her hope. Air Force Instruction 9301, the Inspector General complaint process. She'd heard about it in basic training, but never imagined she'd need to use it. The IG system was specifically designed to protect whistleblowers from retaliation and investigate allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse. "You're working late again," Maria said, appearing in the doorway of the administrative office where Becca was hunched over a computer. "Just catching up on some things," Becca replied, minimizing the screen. Maria closed the door behind her and sat down. "Becca, I've been watching you for the past week. You're not just catching up on anything. You're investigating something big." For a moment, Becca considered denying it. But Maria had been the one person who'd shown her any kindness since she'd arrived. "If I tell you something, do you promise to keep it confidential?" "Depends on what it is." Becca took a deep breath and laid out everything she'd discovered. The missing tools, the falsified records, the theft she'd witnessed, and the connection to the Luke AFB incident. As she spoke, Maria's expression grew increasingly grave. When Becca finished, Maria was quiet for a long time. "Do you have proof of all this?" "Most of it. I've been documenting everything, but I need access to some records that are above my clearance level." Maria stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where F-16 sat under the Nevada stars. "Becca, what you're talking about, if you're right, this is huge. And if you're wrong, or if you can't prove it, Morrison will destroy you. He'll have you court-martialed, kicked out, blacklisted from federal employment. Your military career will be over before it started. And if I do nothing, more pilots could die." Maria turned back to face her, and Becca saw something new in her expression. Respect. "What do you need?" Over the next 3 days, Maria used her quality assurance credentials to help Becca access records that had been locked away. They worked. Carefully, always with legitimate reasons for their requests, building an airtight case piece by piece. The evidence was damning. Morrison had stolen over $50,000 worth of equipment over the past 8 months. He'd falsified inspection records on at least 12 aircraft. He'd created ghost employees in the system to justify overtime payments that went directly to his account. And most disturbing of all, the torque wrench that had caused the Luke AFB incident had been sold to a civilian contractor who'd had it improperly recalibrated. But as their investigation deepened, Morrison began to notice. Danny Torres started showing up in places where Becca was working, always with some excuse, but clearly keeping tabs on her activities. Tools and equipment she needed for her regular duties suddenly became unavailable. Her computer access began getting restricted for security updates that never seemed to finish. "He knows," Becca told Maria one evening as they sat in Maria's car off base. "Morrison knows we're onto him." "Then we need to move fast," Maria replied. "How complete is your documentation?" Becca patted the thick folder in her lap. "Complete enough. I have serial numbers, dates, financial records, and photographic evidence. The only thing I don't have is a recording of him actually admitting what he's doing. Then it's time to file the IG complaint. That night, Becca sat at her computer and began typing the most important document of her military career. Inspector General Complaint Subject: Allegations of fraud, theft, and safety. Violations by Technical Sergeant Jake Morrison. As she typed, she thought about the pilot who'd ejected over Arizona, about all the pilots who were still flying aircraft that Morrison had supposedly inspected, about the oath she'd taken to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Some enemies, she was learning, wore the same uniform you did. The Inspector General's office at Nellis AFB was located in a nondescript building that Becca had walked past dozens of times without noticing. As she approached the entrance with her folder of evidence, she felt like she was crossing a point of no return. Master Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, the IG representative, was a serious woman with 20 years of experience investigating fraud and misconduct. She listened to Becca's presentation without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional documentation. "Airman Martinez," she said when Becca finished, "these are serious allegations. If proven true, Technical Sergeant Morrison could face court-martial, federal criminal charges, and significant prison time. Are you prepared for the level of scrutiny this investigation will bring?" "Yes, ma'am. I understand the stakes." "And you understand that filing a false complaint is itself a criminal offense?" "Yes, ma'am. Everything in that folder is accurate and documented." Master Sergeant Walsh flipped through the evidence one more time, her expression growing more concerned with each page. "I'm opening a formal investigation," she announced. "As of now, you're a protected whistleblower under AFI 9301. Any retaliation against you for this complaint is a separate criminal offense. But I need you to understand something. The protection only works if you report the retaliation immediately. Morrison is going to try to discredit you. He's going to try to destroy your career. If you let him get away with even minor incidents, it makes our job much harder." Over the next 48 hours, the IG investigation began quietly but efficiently. Morrison was interviewed and told that a routine audit had discovered some discrepancies in tool accountability. His records were seized. His computer was impounded. Financial investigators began examining his bank accounts and spending patterns. Morrison was smart enough to know that routine audits didn't happen this way. Someone had complained, and it didn't take him long to figure out who. On Thursday morning, Becca arrived at work to find that she'd been reassigned to the base motor pool, effective immediately. "Congratulations, Martinez," Morrison said in front of the entire shop. "Command has decided you're better suited for vehicle maintenance. Apparently, your skills are being wasted on aircraft." The motor pool assignment was military exile, the place where problem airmen were sent to work on trucks and generators, until they could be processed out of the service. Everyone in the shop knew what it meant. "Damn, Becca," Danny Torres said loud enough for everyone to hear. "What did you do to piss off leadership so bad?" But Becca didn't take the bait. Instead, she simply reported the reassignment to Master Sergeant Walsh, who made a phone call that had Becca back in her original position within an hour. Morrison's expression when she walked back into the shop was one of barely controlled fury. He'd just learned that his ability to retaliate had been neutralized. That afternoon, things escalated further. Becca's supervisor evaluation, which had been due for weeks, suddenly appeared in her file with the lowest possible ratings in every category. The comments section described her as unreliable, insubordinate, and unsuited for military service. But Morrison had made a critical error. The evaluation was backdated to before the IG complaint, which meant he'd been retaliating against her before she'd even officially reported him. It was evidence of consciousness of guilt. By Friday, word had begun to spread that something big was happening. The IG team had expanded to include financial crimes investigators and security forces personnel. Morrison's civilian friends who bought tools and equipment from him were being questioned. Bank records were being subpoenaed. Morrison tried one last desperate move. He called an all-hands meeting and announced that recent security concerns meant that all personnel would be subject to enhanced scrutiny. Anyone found with unauthorized documents or inappropriate access to records would face immediate disciplinary action. "I want everyone to understand," he said, looking directly at Becca, "that disloyalty to your supervisors is disloyalty to the Air Force itself. Some people seem to think they can go around proper channels and cause problems for the whole unit. Those people are wrong. It was a threat, delivered in front of witnesses, and it was exactly the kind of retaliation that would strengthen the IG case against him. After the meeting, several of Becca's co-workers approached her quietly. They'd begun to understand that the routine audit was connected to her mysterious reassignments and Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior. "Is it true?" Airman First Class Lisa Park asked. "Are you the one who reported him?" Becca looked around the shop, seeing her co-workers with new eyes. These weren't enemies or bullies. They were fellow airmen who'd been kept in the dark about their supervisor's crimes. "I can't discuss an ongoing investigation," she said carefully. "But I can tell you that if anyone has information about missing tools or falsified records, the IG office would be very interested to hear about it." By the end of the week, 3 more airmen had filed complaints about Morrison's conduct. The investigation that had started with Becca's careful documentation was becoming a full-scale corruption probe. Morrison was running out of moves, and everyone could see it. The formal hearing took place in the base conference room on a Tuesday morning in March. Becca had been dreading this moment for weeks, knowing that she would have to face Morrison directly and present her evidence to a panel of senior officers who would decide his fate, and possibly hers. Colonel Patricia Stevens, the base's deputy commander, served as the presiding officer. Flanking her were the base's top enlisted advisor, Chief Master Sergeant Robert Martinez, and the staff judge advocate, Major David Kim. The IG investigation had uncovered enough evidence to warrant a formal administrative hearing that could lead to court-martial proceedings. Morrison sat at the respondents' table with his lawyer, a sharp-looking captain from the JAG office. Even facing the most serious allegations of his career, he maintained his intimidating presence, occasionally glaring at Becca as if he could will her into recanting her story. "This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to prefer charges against Technical Sergeant Morrison for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice," Colonel Stevens announced. "The allegations include theft of government property, falsification of official documents, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." Master Sergeant Walsh presented the government's case with methodical precision. Financial records showing Morrison's unexplained income, tool inventory reports documenting systematic theft, maintenance logs with falsified signatures, bank statements tracing stolen equipment sales. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. "I call Senior Airman Rebecca Martinez as the primary witness," Walsh announced. Becca stood on shaking legs and walked to the witness chair. She'd practiced this moment dozens of times, but facing the panel of senior officers and Morrison's hostile stare was more intimidating than she'd imagined. "Airman Martinez," Walsh began, "please tell the panel how you first became aware of irregularities in the tool accountability system." Becca's voice was barely above a whisper as she began to speak, but as she continued, describing her weeks of documentation and the pattern of theft she'd uncovered, her voice grew stronger. She wasn't just a scared junior airman anymore. She was a professional presenting facts. Morrison's lawyer tried to discredit her during cross-examination, suggesting she was a disgruntled airman seeking revenge against a supervisor who'd been tough on her. "Isn't it true, Airman Martinez, that you were struggling to meet performance standards in your unit?" "No, sir. I was consistently meeting or exceeding all assigned tasks." "But you were assigned to administrative duties rather than hands-on. Maintenance. Doesn't that suggest performance issues?" Becca looked directly at Morrison as she answered, "I was assigned to tool inventory specifically because Technical Sergeant Morrison wanted to keep me away from the actual maintenance work. I believe now that he was concerned about what I might discover." "That's speculation, not testimony." "No, sir. It's my professional opinion based on months of observation and documentation." The lawyer pressed harder, but Becca had spent weeks preparing for this moment with Master Sergeant Walsh. Every attack on her credibility was met with documented evidence. Every suggestion that she was lying was countered with specific dates, times, and witnesses. Then came the moment that changed everything. "Airman Martinez," Morrison's lawyer said, "if these thefts were so obvious, why didn't anyone else notice?" Them? Sir, I believe other people did notice. They were just afraid to speak up. Afraid of what? Afraid of Technical Sergeant Morrison's retaliation against anyone who questioned his authority. Morrison's lawyer smiled confidently. But that's just speculation, isn't it? You have no evidence that Technical Sergeant Morrison ever retaliated against anyone. Master Sergeant Walsh stood up. Actually, we do. She nodded to the back of the room where the door opened to admit Danny Torres. But instead of sitting with Morrison's supporters, he walked to the witness stand. Airman Torres has requested to testify for the government, Walsh announced. Morrison's face went white. His lawyer looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Danny's testimony was devastating. He described months of helping Morrison steal equipment, falsify records, and intimidate other airmen into silence. He explained how Morrison had recruited him by threatening to destroy his career if he didn't cooperate, then gradually made him complicit in increasingly serious crimes. "Why are you coming forward now?" Walsh asked. Danny looked at Becca, then back at the panel. "Because Airman Martinez showed me that doing the right thing was more important than being afraid. And because I couldn't live with knowing that my silence might get someone killed." Morrison's lawyer tried to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. Danny's testimony corroborated every aspect of Becca's case and added details she'd never known about. In his closing argument, Morrison's lawyer painted him as a dedicated NCO who'd made some administrative errors but was being railroaded by disgruntled subordinates. Master Sergeant Walsh's closing was different. She simply read the names of the pilots who'd been flying aircraft that Morrison had falsely certified as safe. She displayed photos of the F-16 that had crashed at Luke AFB. She reminded the panel that military justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about protecting the lives of the men and women who served. When Colonel Stevens announced that the panel would recommend court-martial proceedings on multiple felony charges, Morrison finally showed emotion. His confident facade cracked, and for the first time since Becca had known him, he looked like what he really was, a criminal who'd been caught. As the hearing ended, Morrison was escorted from the room by security forces personnel. He would spend the night in confinement awaiting his court-martial. Becca remained in her seat, emotionally drained, but finally feeling like she could breathe freely for the first time in months. Colonel Stevens approached her as the room emptied. "Airman Martinez, what you did took tremendous courage. The Air Force needs more people like you." But Becca was looking at Danny Torres, who was standing uncertainly near the door. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "The Air Force needs more people willing to do the right thing, even when it's scary. I'm just glad I finally figured out how to be one of them." The weeks following Morrison's court-martial were surreal for Becca. The man who had dominated her life with intimidation and fear was gone, sentenced to 4 years in military prison and a dishonorable discharge. The shop felt different without his overwhelming presence. Lighter somehow, like a storm had passed. Chief Master Sergeant Patricia Diaz, Morrison's replacement, was everything he wasn't. A 22-year veteran with a reputation for fairness and competence, she called Becca into her office on her first day. "Airman Martinez, I've read your entire file, including the IG complaint and testimony. I want you to know that what you did was exceptional. You saved lives and protected the integrity of this unit." "Thank you, Chief. I was just doing what I thought was right." "That's exactly why it was exceptional. Most people know what's right. Not everyone has the courage to act on it." Chief Diaz made immediate changes to the shop's culture. True accountability became a shared responsibility rather than busy work assigned to junior airmen. Regular inspections were scheduled and actually performed. Most importantly, she instituted an open-door policy that encouraged airmen to bring forward concerns without fear of retaliation. The changes extended beyond just procedures. Becca's co-workers, who had initially seen her as an odd outsider, now treated her with genuine respect. They'd witnessed her stand up to Morrison when no one else would, and they understood that her quiet strength had protected all of them. Danny Torres remained in the unit, having received administrative punishment rather than court-martial in exchange for his cooperation. The relationship between him and Becca was awkward at first. He'd been part of the system that had made her life miserable, but gradually they developed a mutual respect. "I want you to know," he told her one day, "I was wrong about you from the beginning. I thought you were weak because you didn't fight back the way I expected. I didn't understand that you were fighting back in a smarter way." 3 months after Morrison's conviction, Becca received notification that she'd been selected for promotion to staff sergeant, 2 years ahead of her normal eligibility date. More importantly, she'd been accepted to the Air Force's highly competitive quality assurance program, the career field she'd actually wanted when she first enlisted. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. She received a letter from Captain Jennifer Walsh, the pilot who'd safely ejected from the F-16 at Luke AFB. The investigation had determined that Morrison's falsified maintenance records had directly contributed to the engine failure. "I wanted to thank you personally," the letter read. "Your courage in reporting the maintenance fraud likely prevented other pilots from experiencing what I went through. In the military, we talk a lot about having each other's backs. You had mine before you even knew my name." Maria, who had been promoted to technical sergeant, remained Becca's closest friend on base. They often worked together on quality assurance inspections, with Becca's attention to detail complementing Maria's experience and leadership. "You know what I find funny?" Maria asked one day as they reviewed maintenance records. "Morrison always said you weren't cut out for real military work. Turns out he was right, in a way." "How do you mean?" "You weren't cut out for the kind of military work he was doing, cutting corners, covering up problems, putting people at risk. You were built for the real thing: integrity, accountability, protecting people." 6 months after the hearing, Becca received orders to attend the Non-Commissioned Officer Academy, a clear signal that the Air Force saw her as future leadership material. As she prepared for the assignment, she reflected on how much had changed since she'd first arrived at Nellis. She was still quiet, still analytical, still the type of person who noticed details others missed, but she was no longer afraid to speak up when those details mattered. The night before leaving for school, Becca had dinner with her parents, who had driven from San Antonio to see her off. Her father, the Desert Storm veteran, seemed particularly proud. "Mija, when you first called me worried about doing the right thing when it was dangerous, I knew you'd figure it out. But I didn't know you'd do it so well." Her mother, who had been quiet during dinner, reached across the table and squeezed Becca's hand. "Your father and I always knew you were strong. We just didn't know the Air Force would help you find out how strong." That evening, as Becca packed her bags, she found the original notebook where she'd first started documenting the tool discrepancies. The pages were filled with her careful handwriting, documenting serial numbers and dates that had seemed so important at the time. Now they looked like evidence of a different person, someone who had seen problems but wasn't yet ready to confront them directly. She thought about keeping the notebook as a reminder, then decided to throw it away. She didn't need reminders of who she used to be. She knew who she was now. 2 years later, Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez stood in front of a classroom at Nellis Air Force Base, teaching new airmen about tool accountability and quality assurance procedures. It was a role she'd never imagined for herself, but one that felt natural now. "The most important thing you need to understand," she told the class of fresh-faced 18 and 19-year-olds, "is that every procedure, every checklist, every form you fill out exists for a reason. Someone's life depends on you getting it right." After class, a young airman named Jessica Kim approached her. She was quiet, serious, and reminded Becca of herself at that age. "Sergeant Martinez, what do you do if you notice something wrong, but you're not sure if you should say anything?" The question brought Becca back to her own first days at Nellis, when she'd noticed discrepancies but had been too intimidated to speak up immediately. "What kind of wrong are we talking about, Airman Kim?" "Just administrative stuff. Probably nothing important." Becca recognized the uncertainty in the young woman's voice. "Why don't you come by my office tomorrow and we can discuss it privately?" The next afternoon, Jessica laid out a familiar story: a supervisor who was cutting corners on inspections, records that didn't match reality, a culture of intimidation that discouraged questions. "I don't want to cause trouble," Jessica said. "I just want to do my job." Airman Kim, Can I tell you something I learned the hard way? Sometimes doing your job means causing trouble for people who aren't doing theirs. Becca helped Jessica document her concerns and report them through proper channels. The investigation that followed led to another supervisor's removal and significant changes in that unit's procedures. But more importantly, it established Jessica as someone who could be trusted to do the right thing. The pattern continued over the next several years. Young airmen, usually quiet and observant ones, would come to Becca with concerns about safety violations, misconduct, or ethical lapses. She became known as someone who would listen, who would help navigate the system, and who would protect whistleblowers from retaliation. Colonel Stevens, now the base commander, took notice of this unofficial mentoring role. She called Becca into her office one day with an unexpected proposal. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, I'm creating a new position, Inspector General Liaison, someone who works with junior personnel to help them understand how to report problems and navigate the complaint process. I want you to consider applying." "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of responsibility." Colonel Stevens smiled. "Sergeant, you've been doing this job informally for 2 years. The only difference would be making it official and giving you the authority to really help people." 6 months later, Becca found herself with a new title and a new mission. She wasn't just maintaining aircraft anymore, she was maintaining the integrity of the entire base. The irony wasn't lost on her. Morrison had tried to silence her by assigning her to administrative duties as a punishment. Now administrative duties, specifically helping others find their voice, had become her calling. On quiet evenings, Becca sometimes thought about Morrison. She'd heard through the military grapevine that he'd served his time and been released from prison. He was working as a mechanic at a civilian garage somewhere in Florida, his military career and benefits permanently gone. She didn't take satisfaction in his downfall exactly, but she was glad that he could no longer put people's lives at risk through his corruption and intimidation. Danny Torres had been promoted to staff sergeant and become one of the most respected maintainers on base. He still worked in the same shop where he'd once been Morrison's accomplice, but now he was known for his integrity and attention to safety. He occasionally stopped by Becca's office to thank her for showing him that there was a better way to serve. "You know what's funny?" he said during one of these visits. "Morrison used to say that the military wasn't a place for people like you. Turns out he was wrong about that too. The military needs more people exactly like you." Chief Diaz, who had replaced Morrison, was now the base's senior enlisted advisor. She often cited Becca's case in her leadership classes as an example of how one person's courage could transform an entire organization. "Some people think leadership is about commanding others," she would tell her students, "but sometimes the most important leadership comes from someone who's willing to stand alone and do what's right even when everyone else is looking the other way." Maria, now a master sergeant, remained Becca's closest friend and frequent collaborator. They often worked together on complex investigations, with Maria providing the experience and Becca providing the analytical skills that had first uncovered Morrison's crimes. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria asked one day as they reviewed another case. "Taking on Morrison, I mean. Your life would have been a lot simpler if you'd just kept quiet." Becca thought about the question seriously. Her life had indeed become more complicated. She dealt with difficult cases, hostile witnesses, and the constant pressure of being responsible for other people's safety. But she also went to bed every night knowing that she'd used her skills to protect people. "No," she said finally. "Simple isn't always better. Besides, I don't think I really had a choice. Once I saw what was happening, I couldn't unsee it." On her 5th anniversary at Nellis AFB, Becca received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo of an F-16 pilot standing next to her aircraft, smiling and giving a thumbs up. On the back was written, "Still flying safe thanks to people like you. Captain J. Walsh." Becca put the photo on her desk next to others from airmen she'd helped over the years. Each one represented someone who'd found the courage to speak up about wrongdoing, usually because they'd learned from her example that doing the right thing was possible. That evening, as she walked across the base toward her quarters, Becca reflected on how much had changed since her first terrifying days under Morrison's supervision. She was still the same person in many ways, quiet, analytical, more comfortable with facts than small talk. but she was no longer afraid. She'd learned that strength didn't always look like what people expected. Sometimes it looked like a quiet airman with thick glasses, carefully documenting evidence and methodically building a case. Sometimes it looked like choosing to speak truth to power, even when power tried to silence you. Most importantly, she'd learned that integrity wasn't just about what you did when no one was watching. Sometimes it was about what you did when everyone was watching and hoping you'd stay silent. As she reached her quarters, Becca's phone buzzed with a text from a young airman she'd been mentoring. "Sergeant Martinez, that thing we discussed last week, I think I'm ready to file the complaint. Can you help me?" Becca smiled and typed back, "Of course. Come by my office first thing Monday morning. We'll figure it out together." The cycle continued. Another quiet airman finding their voice, another person learning that doing the right thing, while never easy, was always possible. And Becca Martinez, who had once been dismissed as too weak for military service, continued to be exactly what the Air Force needed. Someone who understood that true strength came not from intimidation or fear, but from the quiet courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Her legacy wasn't written in commendations or promotion ceremonies. It was written in the lives of the airmen she'd protected, the pilots who flew safely because of her vigilance, and the young service members who learned from her example that one person really could make a difference. She remained humble about her role in all of it. When people called her a hero, she always corrected them. "I'm not a hero," she would say. "I'm just someone who pays attention. The real heroes are the people who see problems and decide to do something about them, even when it's scary." But that, of course, was exactly what made her heroic. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.